On December 6th, 1907, something deep inside the coal tunnels beneath Monongah, West Virginia, produced a spark. What happened in the next few seconds destroyed both mines, killed every man inside them, blew the timber headframes off their foundations, and sent a concussion wave through the Monongahela River Valley that people felt for miles. Nobody on the surface knew what had happened yet. They felt the ground move, and they saw black smoke rising from the mine portal. The men who had not gone down that morning started running toward the mine entrance. But what they found there stopped them. If you are new to Steel and Sweat, this channel covers the machines and the men of American industrial history, the things that built the country, and the things those things cost. Subscribe and leave a comment with the next story you want us to dig into. Monongah in 1907 was a company town in every meaningful sense of the term, built around the coal operations that the Fairmont Coal Company, a subsidiary of Consolidation Coal, had been expanding through the previous decade along the West Fork River in Marion County, West Virginia. Rows of identical wooden company houses climbed the hillsides above the mine works. The town's population was the mine's workforce and their families, and the Fairmont Coal Company was one of dozens of large coal operators that had transformed the West Virginia mountains into the industrial backbone of American steel production. The mine's workforce was, by 1907, predominantly men who had come from Italy in the previous few years through the labor contractor networks that were funneling Southern and Eastern European immigrants directly from the docks at Baltimore and New York into the coal fields and steel towns of the industrial interior. Many of the Italian men who went to work in Monongah's mines had been in the United States for less than 2 years. They had come from villages in the Campania and Basilicata regions of southern Italy, traveling by steamship across the Atlantic and arriving through the immigrant processing halls at Ellis Island or the Baltimore piers, where labor contractors met them with promises of steady wages in the American coalfields. They arrived in Monongah, speaking no English, moving into crowded boarding houses alongside men from their same villages or regions, working alongside men they could communicate with, and living in proximity to the English-speaking world without being part of it in any functional sense. The coal mine was, in this respect, an equalizer. Underground, where the work was done, language mattered less than the ability to drill, load, and blast a working section without killing the men around you. The mines beneath Monongah were room and pillar operations, the standard American underground coal mining method of the period. Teams of miners, typically 2 men working a section, drilled into the coal face using hand-cranked or compressed air drills, packed the holes with black powder charges, blasted the coal loose from the seam, loaded the broken coal into iron mine cars with hand shovels, and sent the loaded cars out along underground rail lines to the surface tipple where the coal was weighed and sorted. The pillars of unremoved coal that the room and pillar method left standing throughout the mine were the structural support for the roof above. The ventilation system that kept the underground atmosphere, breathable moved air through the entry tunnels by means of a large steam-powered surface fan, pulling fresh air in through one opening and exhausting the spent air, carrying methane gas off-gassed from the coal seam and carbon monoxide from the blasting out through another. The 2 mines shared a ventilation system and were connected underground through cross-entries that allowed the air circuit to move between them. The connection between the 2 mines was the reason 362 men died instead of the roughly 170 who were working in whichever mine the explosion originated in. Because mines number 6 and number 8 shared underground passages and a ventilation circuit, the explosion that started in one propagated into the other. This is the specific mechanical fact that made Monongah the largest mine disaster in American history, rather than simply a large one. The morning of December 6 was a Friday, and it was a working day like any other in a West Virginia coal town. Men who'd come from villages in Campania and Basilicata and from American towns throughout Marion County had eaten whatever breakfast their crowded boarding house or their wives had put in front of them, had collected their tin dinner pails and their carbide cap lamps, and had walked through the pre-dawn streets of Monongah to the mine portals. The iron cage at the top of the shaft headframe took them down in groups through the mine collar and into the darkness below. Those who had been doing this for years dropped into the underground without ceremony, walking to their assigned sections along the timber-shored entry tunnels with the acetylene flame of the lamp on their cap, throwing light 3 feet ahead of them and knowing by practice exactly how many steps to their working place. Those who were newer to the work followed the men they knew. By mid-morning, the mines were fully populated with working shifts. The sound underground was the sound of work, the rhythmic percussion of drilling, the hollow crack of a charge going off somewhere in a far section, the grinding of loaded mine cars moving along the entry rails toward the surface. The men worked in pairs in their assigned rooms, the loader on one side of the face, the driller preparing the next shot on the other. Between them, the understanding that the day's wages depended on the tons loaded, and the tons loaded depended on working continuously, and continuous work in a coal mine in 1907 meant staying in proximity to everything that could kill you. The official number of men recorded underground in mines number 6 and number 8 that morning was 367. The number actually underground was almost certainly higher, by an amount that cannot be precisely known, for reasons that would become central to the disaster's history in the days and years following. American coal mining in the early 20th century operated under virtually no federal safety regulation. State mine inspection programs varied enormously in their resources and authority. In West Virginia, mine inspectors were appointed through a political process that gave the large coal operators considerable influence over who filled the positions, and the inspection intervals for any given mine could be months apart. When investigators from the United States Geological Survey and state mine inspection offices examined the major disasters of the period, they consistently found that the conditions producing those disasters were known hazards that had been present and unaddressed for extended periods before the explosion. This was the regulatory environment in which the men of Monongah went to work each morning. To understand what happened at that moment that morning, you have to understand the physics of a coal mine explosion, because it is not the same physics as a single blast or a gas ignition in a contained space. It is something specific and catastrophic, and the coal industry had known for decades that it was possible and had not done enough to prevent it. Coal mines produce methane gas continuously as the coal seam is disturbed. Methane is lighter than air and accumulates in the high points of mine entries and rooms if ventilation is insufficient to carry it out. A working mine with adequate ventilation keeps methane concentrations below the lower explosive limit of about 5% by volume, at which point methane becomes flammable. But ventilation in a working mine of 1907 was not a precision system. It was a fan and a set of doors and brattice curtains that directed airflow through the entries, and its effectiveness in any given working section depended on whether those doors were properly maintained and whether the curtains had been damaged by the traffic of loaded mine cars. In a mine with multiple active sections and variable ventilation quality, methane pockets were a constant possibility. But methane ignition alone, while dangerous, does not typically produce the scale of destruction that occurred at Monongah. What produces that scale is coal dust. A coal mine, after a shift of drilling, blasting, and loading, is coated in fine coal dust on its walls, its floor, and suspended in its air. Coal dust at sufficient concentration is explosive, and the range of concentration at which it is explosive is much wider than for methane. What a methane ignition does in a dusty mine is provide the initial energy release to entrain the coal dust from the surfaces around it, which then burns in a propagating front that moves down entries and through rooms faster than any person can run, carrying the force of the explosion ahead of it and the burning atmosphere behind it. That process is called a coal dust explosion, and it is the mechanism that destroyed both Monongah mines in the seconds after whatever produced the initial spark at that hour on December 6, 1907. The probable ignition source was a blown-out shot. Black powder charges in coal mine blasting were packed into drill holes and ignited by a fuse, and the physics of the blast were supposed to drive the coal forward into the working space. But if the packing was insufficient, or the hole geometry wrong, or the charge too large for the conditions, The explosion could blow back out of the hole and eject burning material into the mine atmosphere. A blown-out shot in a section with elevated methane concentration was a known cause of mine explosions, and the practice of blasting during working hours, when the mine was occupied and the dust from the previous loading shift had not settled, was recognized as significantly more dangerous than blasting in cleared sections. But in Monongah, in 1907, as in most American coal mines of the period, production pressure and the piece rate wage structure that paid miners by the ton they loaded meant that blasting during working hours was standard practice rather than an exception. Could you imagine being 300 feet underground when that pressure wave hit, in the dark except for your carbide lamp, with no way to know which direction was out? For most of the men in number 6 and number 8 that morning, there was no surviving the first seconds. The force of the explosion, traveling through the confined entries of a coal mine, would have been unsurvivable at the distances involved. Some men at the outer edges of the mine, closest to the surface entries, may have survived the initial explosion, but what followed the explosion made survival nearly impossible, regardless of position. The explosion damaged the ventilation fan. Without the fan, the mine's air circuit collapsed, and the atmosphere inside the mine filled with afterdamp, the mixture of carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen that remains after a mine explosion consumes the oxygen in the available air. Afterdamp kills quickly and silently, and it was afterdamp as much as the explosion itself that killed whatever men had survived the initial blast. It also made rescue entry immediately and continuously dangerous for the men who arrived at the surface portal in the minutes after the explosion and tried to go in. The men on the surface in the immediate aftermath understood that the scale of what had happened was beyond any normal mine accident. The ventilation fan house near the surface portal was damaged. The timber headframe over the shaft had taken the force of the blast coming up the entry. Smoke was rising from multiple points along the surface above the mine workings. The women of Monongah, whose houses were within earshot of the mine, had felt the concussion. By noon, on December 6th, the hillsides above the mine portal were filled with people. The rescue attempts began within an hour of the explosion. Coal miners from neighboring operations in Marion County, company foremen, and volunteers from Monongah and the surrounding communities went to the mine entrance with whatever hand tools and lanterns they had. Some went in without breathing apparatus because none was available. Some collapsed from afterdamp poisoning inside the mine portal and had to be dragged back out by the men behind them. The Draeger breathing apparatus that would eventually become standard mine rescue equipment in America existed in Germany by 1907, but had not been adopted by American mining operations. Organized mine rescue stations with trained teams and the proto-breathing equipment needed to work in a post-explosion atmosphere simply did not exist anywhere in the United States at the time of the Monongah disaster. What existed was courage and improvisation, and neither was sufficient to reach the men who might have survived in the mine's deepest sections before the afterdamp reached them. If you're finding this history as important as anything we've covered on this channel, go ahead and hit subscribe right now and leave a comment below with the next story you want to see. The bodies came out over days, then weeks. The mine was worked section by section as the ventilation was gradually restored, and each cleared section produced more dead. The company brought in experienced miners from other operations. The state of West Virginia sent what assistance it could. The Italian consul in Pittsburgh traveled to Monongah to document the deaths of Italian nationals and was among the witnesses who observed what the recovery operation was finding. The death toll of 362 that became the official number was itself a contested figure from the moment it was established. The problem was the roster. The Fairmont Coal Company maintained a payroll record of the men officially employed in the mines, and the official toll was compiled from that record against the men who did not report for work the following day, or who were confirmed recovered from the mine. But the payroll record was not a complete accounting of who was underground that morning. The piece rate wage system meant that miners were paid by the coal they loaded rather than by the hour they worked. A miner who brought his teenage son or a newly arrived neighbor's son underground to help load coal and share the wages might or might not have reported that additional person to the company, depending on whether the person was officially employed or simply working informally alongside the miner. Boys below the legal minimum age worked in American coal mines in 1907, sometimes on the books under falsified ages, and sometimes off the books entirely. And in a workforce composed largely of immigrant men whose names were recorded by English-speaking clerks with varying degrees of familiarity with Italian names, the accuracy of the payroll record as a complete census of who was present on any given morning was limited by the quality of that transcription. Investigators and historians who have examined the Monongah disaster in subsequent decades have consistently estimated the actual death toll as higher than 362. Some estimates run to 367, accounting for specific documented individuals not on the official roster. Others, including work by Italian-American historians, examining the consular records and the records of Italian regional societies that paid survivor benefits to families in Italy, have suggested totals ranging up to 500. The definitive answer does not exist because the complete roster of men present in mines number 6 and number 8 on the morning of December 6, 1907, was destroyed with the mines and never reconstructed. What can be said with certainty is that the official number was a floor, not an accounting. The 250 widows and more than 1,000 children left in Monongah and the surrounding communities after December 6th had no legal framework for compensation. The Pennsylvania Workmen's Compensation Act, which would later change the financial structure of industrial injury liability in one of the most important states for coal and steel, was not passed until 1915. West Virginia had no compensation law in 1907. The common law doctrine of assumption of risk, under which a worker who voluntarily entered a dangerous occupation was held to have accepted the risks inherent in it and could not hold the employer liable for injuries unless negligence could be proven, governed the legal landscape. Proving negligence against the Fairmont Coal Company would have required surviving workers who could testify to specific safety violations, and those workers were underground. The Fairmont Coal Company made voluntary payments to surviving families. The amounts varied, and the total paid out was a fraction of the company's annual revenue from the two mines before the explosion. There was no obligation, no schedule, and no enforcement mechanism. Families who remained in Monongah and had relationships with the company's local management received more than families who had returned to Italy. Many of the Italian immigrant families returned to Italy because there was nothing in Monongah keeping them there once the man who had brought them was gone. The Italian government's response was more substantial than the company's in one respect. It sent consular officials to document the deaths, worked with Italian regional mutual aid societies to direct survivor benefits to families in Italy, and raised the visibility of the disaster in the Italian press in ways that contributed to the diplomatic pressure that eventually led to negotiations over the treatment of Italian immigrant workers in American industry. But the men in the ground in Monongah were not helped by diplomatic negotiations, and the families they left in West Virginia and in southern Italy lived the following decades without them. The community that the disaster left behind in Monongah was predominantly female within 48 hours of the explosion. The men who had not been underground that morning were the exceptions, the shift foremen and surface workers and the miners who happened to have been sick or injured or assigned elsewhere. Every other household in the Italian neighborhoods on the hillsides above the mine had a woman waiting for information the company could not yet provide because the recovery operation had not reached most of the mine sections. The waiting lasted days, then weeks, and for some families it ended without a body, without a confirmed identity, without anything but the absence. The mutual aid societies that the Italian immigrant communities had organized, the regional associations, named for the provinces their members had come from, became the primary social support structure for widows and children in the immediate aftermath. They collected money from members in other cities and other states who had heard the news and recognized the names of the towns the dead had come from. The Italian consul in Pittsburgh made the journey to Monongah to record the deaths and to arrange for the transmission of the information to families in Italy who did not yet know they were widows. The letters that carried that information, translated and transmitted through the consular system, reached villages in Campania and Basilicata in the weeks after December 6, 1907, and some of the women who received them had already received the money their husbands had sent home before they went into the mine that last morning. The Fairmont Coal Company's management visited Monongah, expressed condolences, and began the process of assessing the mines for return to production. The company needed to know whether the mines could be repaired and whether the remaining coal reserves were recoverable. Both questions were answered yes, but the question of when and in what form and with what workforce was answered by the market and the company's business interests, rather than by any consideration of the community's needs or the family's circumstances. The policy response to Monongah came in the form of the United States Bureau of Mines, established by an act of Congress in 1910 in the aftermath of a string of catastrophic mine explosions in 1907 and 1908 that had made the absence of any federal oversight of mine safety impossible to defend publicly. Monongah in December 1907 was the largest single event, but it was preceded by the Naomi mine explosion in Fayette County, Pennsylvania in January 1907, which killed 34 men, and followed by the Dar mine explosion in Jacobs Creek, Pennsylvania in December 1907, which killed 239 miners just 3 weeks after Monongah. Together, those three explosions killed more than 630 men in a single calendar year, and the photographs of the recovery operations at all three sites appeared in American newspapers, alongside the congressional testimony of mine inspectors and coal company officials that followed. The pattern was undeniable, and the congressional hearings held in Washington in 1908 and 1909 cited Monongah repeatedly as the defining case for federal action. But the Bureau of Mines, as established in 1910, had no regulatory authority. It could investigate disasters, conduct research into mine safety, and publish recommendations. It could not require operators to implement those recommendations. The authority to mandate safety practices in coal mines remained with the states, and the variation in state enforcement was as wide in 1910 as it had been in 1907. The federal enforcement authority that would eventually produce meaningful, uniform mine safety. Standards did not arrive until the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act of 1969, 62 years after Monongah, passed in the aftermath of the Farmington mine disaster in West Virginia that killed 78 men in 1968. The mine where those men died in 1968 was in Marion County, West Virginia, the same county as Monongah. The men who died on December 6, 1907, beneath the hills of Marion County were the largest single group of workers killed in a single industrial event in American history. The date is now observed internationally as Miners' Day, a designation created by international miners' union organizations to ensure that December 6th carried a specific historical weight, that the number 362 appeared in calendars and labor commemorations in coal mining communities from Appalachia to Wales to the Silesian coal fields, that the scale of what happened in West Virginia was not absorbed into the general background noise of industrial mortality that the early 20th century produced in such volume that any individual event could disappear into it. Some of the men from mines number 6 and number 8 are still in those mines. The recovery operation cleared most of the accessible sections, but not all of them, and in the deepest areas, where the explosion's force had been greatest and the structural collapse most complete, some sections were sealed rather than cleared. The men in those sections were never brought out. Monongah is above them. The river that runs past the site of mines number 6 and number 8 is the same river that ran past them on the morning of December 6, 1907, when the men whose names are still being counted walked down into the ground before dawn and did not come back up. The town that existed because of those mines no longer exists in its 1907 form. The boarding houses and the company store and the shift schedule rhythms that organized every waking hour having dissolved over the decades that followed, but the ground is the same ground, and the depth at which those men are is the same depth it has always been. The only record of most of their names is in the surviving payroll books and the company ledgers and the consular documents and the mutual aid society records that have been preserved in archives in West Virginia and in regional government offices in Campania and Basilicata, in the villages where the women who had waited for letters that stopped arriving in December 1907 eventually stopped waiting, and where their children grew up knowing the name of the mine and the date and almost nothing else. If this history matters to you, subscribe to Steel and Sweat and let me know in the comments which story from the American industrial era you want covered next. Every video on this channel exists to make sure these men and this work are not forgotten.